Hello, this is Discourse and Dialogue. Today we have something a little bit different. We have a guest here, activist Joe Seeman. He's running for the 112th district in Schenectady and Saratoga counties. And I'm going to let him explain his campaign, who he is, and a little about himself. Joe?
Okay, thanks, Victor, and feel free to interrupt. I'm running for New York State Assembly in the 112th district. That comprises 8 towns in Saratoga County and 1 town in Schenectady County. And I've been a lifelong, or quite a few decades, fighter for justice, for fairness, for peace, for the economic interests of the 99%. And I've been fighting for issues like campaign finance reform to try and get the corruption of big money out of politics, and that's a big problem we have in Albany here. I've been fighting to see that we all have health care, that no one dies because they miss an insurance payment or because they don't have the medication they need. I've been fighting for many decades to transition to a 100% clean energy, renewable energy economy. And many of us have been talking about this for decades. And I was a state worker. I'm retired. I was a software developer for the state of New York. I was a proud union member. And I've been a part-time activist. And now I'm looking to take the fight inside the New York State Legislature. And the district that I'm running for in Saratoga County and Schenectady counties has an assembly representative who really doesn't do very much. So I wouldn't want to criticize her for what she's done, but more what she hasn't done. And I want to talk about what I can do, what the New York State Legislature can do, and what we can do. Primarily, it's all about building a future for our children, our grandchildren, for the future economy of upstate New York.
In a few words, what would you say your mission is?
My mission is to represent the economic interests, represent the interests of the average people of Saratoga and Schenectady counties, and that's not the same as the interests of the richest 1%, Wall Street billionaires, big corporate CEOs. And I think everything comes down to which side are you on? Are you on the side of the ultra rich, or really on the side of just about everybody?
If you were asked what would be, and you're being asked now.
Sure, I'm being asked.
What would be your vision, say, for how government would operate that isn't happening now?
Sure. Well, that's a very big question here, so we'll take it in
Take
a small piece. And I appreciate the opportunity to be interviewed here today. Let's talk about how campaigns are financed. That's a structural problem. It's a causal problem. So all the other issues, the reason that we don't get the results that average people need is because the system is corrupt. And we hear about people in the New York State Legislature going to jail. The biggest leaders, Joe Bruno, Shelley Silver, gone in scandal and disgrace. And really, the biggest corruption is the money in the political system. So we can do, like some states, such as Connecticut and New York City has a system where small donors, small donations, small amounts are matched. It's matching funds from public funds. And it can increase the voice and the power of average people and thereby decrease the influence of big money, which is all too much of a problem. And I think everybody knows this. If you ask people, do politicians tend to represent you? Does government represent you? Well, maybe in somewhat, but to a large extent, you have corporate interests, Wall Street, billionaires, and they're funding political campaigns. And it's effectively legalized bribery. So we want to end legalized bribery, and that will allow us to do the other critical things we need to do. So I'll just talk about a few of them. And there's a lot of things we all need to do. And New York State is a big place. If New York State was a separate nation, it would be the 13th largest economy in the world. So there's a lot of people, about 20 million people. There's a lot of money at stake. People pay their taxes. And how does that all work? So there's a whole lot to be done if we have honest, ethical government, not corrupted government. That's the basic starting point. And I can talk a little bit about some of the policies that we need to affect.
Before we get to that,
Sure.
I just want to let you know that what we do on this podcast is we look at the physics of politics very often. One of our analysis is that the different political groupings, parties, have a economic interest on one level or another in the production process. There are those who finance, and they have their representatives in government. And then there's actual producers or retailers, and producers of products and retailers. And then the popular misconception and misuse by all of them is that to think that there is this other entity called consumer. And nobody ever seems to recognize the essence of all of it is labor.
Right.
So labor is always forgotten. Labor is transformed into a thing called consumer.
Right.
And then ostensibly each of those groups has representatives, and that's why you see sometimes conflict between them, even though they all are in representing an interest within the production process. And that's what lends itself, that production process lends itself to something of a physics. Where would you see yourself in this theoretical framework?
Okay. So you talked a little bit about labor. I mentioned that I was a union member. I'm pro-labor, and I think what we need to think of labor more than just the small number of us who have been or are or have been unionized, and think of a larger picture of average working class people. That's what labor is. And we know that over the past few decades, the middle class has not seen much growth. The ultra wealthy have gotten madly rich. So we've seen the richest 1% gain almost all of the wealth over the past few decades. We've seen the economy grow. We have computers, we have technology, we've got lots of things in this world that we didn't have a few decades ago, and there's been huge growth in wealth in America. America is a wealthy country. New York is a wealthy state. The problem is that the very rich have taken just about all the wealth growth, and average people haven't. And talking about labor, one of the reasons that we haven't seen average poor and middle class people gaining that growth is because we haven't had very much labor union representation, labor union participation. And there are laws. I mean, there are laws on the books that make it difficult for people to organize labor unions, and there are laws that we can change to make it easier. So we can, one of the things we'll need to do is try and make it easier for people to join labor unions, because that's one of the ways the middle class was created in America, by people joining unions. So we need to expand our notion of labor and build labor. And so that's one place I fall in. I also fall in along the side of small business and not on the side of very big business. And I know that people throw a lot of terms, socialism and capitalism, try and categorize you.
As if they knew what they were talking about.
That's right. That's right. And there's so I think that we need to come together. People who consider themselves labor, whether they're part of a labor union or just working class people, or people who are entrepreneurs and small business persons. Also, we have common interests. Almost all of us have common interests, but there is a systematic, organized class effort by the very richest 1% to take more than their fair share. So, for example, let's talk a little bit about taxes that we all pay. And that's a great hat you've got there, Victor. A great tie and a great jacket. I bet you paid sales tax on each of those things, right?
Oh, I'm sure.
7 or 8% or so. Okay. Now, Wall Street, big money people, they don't spend much of their money buying hats and ties. I mean, they buy them too, but they buy and sell stocks. And do you know what the sales tax? You're paying like 7% or more on your clothing. What do you think they're paying sales tax on those stocks?
I have no idea.
Okay. Well, they're paying not a dime. and the crazy thing here, there's actually a law on the books for 0.25%, a very, very small fraction, sales tax on stocks. And it was on the books 1905. And it was law, and Wall Street was paying that tax until about 1980, about 40 years ago or so. And now it's being rebated for the past few decades. And rebated means they don't actually pay a dime. So that's just one example. And by the way, we're talking about some serious change. If we started to collect that, we're talking, let's say, about $14 billion a year. And you hear our legislature and our governor arguing about the, $5 billion or so shortfall due to the Medicaid costs. Well, we don't need to cut. Maybe we can make Medicaid more efficient, but we don't need to cut any services. We don't need to have anybody who needs their health care say, sorry, you don't qualify for Medicaid and too bad for you. So these are some of the things that are on the table in the New York State Legislature, and there's a lot of money on the table in the budget that they're working on, and it really comes down to, on tax and lots of other issues, pretty much every issue, that there's the interests of average people, and then there's a very small minority of very wealthy people who are trying to rig the system, and in fact have very successfully rigged the system to their benefit and to our detriment. And really, that I can talk to you about lots of other issues, but the same principle applies, and that's why I'm running for New York State Legislature. I'm running as a working families Democrat, and I plan to, when elected, caucus with the Democratic majority. My opponent, the incumbent, who's a Republican, doesn't have any say whatsoever into the budget. She has nothing to say about it, into any significant legislation. She's been in office 3 years, hasn't been part of any big legislation on any of the big issues. And she collects a nice salary. You know, they pay for a part-time job. Remember, the New York State Assembly and the Senate, they're in session half a year, less than half a year, getting $110,000. I think that's too much. If I'm elected, I'm going to give back some of that money. So there's a lot. Go ahead.
That brings up some what I call margin questions. Those things you write in the margin of your newspaper, or the throwaway things you do when you're watching these politicians, and you get up to get a soda or something like that, and so you hear something like Bloomberg, for example, spending $188 million on a campaign. There's only 167 million voters.
It's a lot of money.
Why doesn't he just give everybody $1 million?
Well,
I'd vote for him for $1 million.
Okay. Well, actually, he is doing his best to try and buy his influence, and I must tell you, my perspective. In my perspective, I live here in upstate, but I have family who live in New York City, and they had a lot of problems with Bloomberg when he was mayor of New York City. But if he's the Democratic nominee, I mean, just compare him to Donald Trump. So if we're talking about money influencing politics, you have the money of a Russian dictator and his oligarchs. When we were told, growing up, you and I probably were told, we've got to worry about the Russians Russian communists taking over America. And Khrushchev, if you'll remember, this is a long time ago, probably most of your viewers this is before their time, said that they'll take over America without even having to fire a bullet. So you have
Like Lenin
much
said, they'll sell us the rope to hang them.
That's true. So, as bad as the problem of Bloomberg buying his influence, we have even worse. We have foreign dictators, and we have the impeached White House resident, whose name I'll try not to mention if I can't avoid it, who is welcomed foreign dictators and oligarchs to influence and buy political influence in America. We saw this in 2016, and it's happening again. And I just want to add that it's not just the guy in the White House, but every single GOP politician who supports him welcomes Russian dictator oligarchy money influencing.
Well, Mitch McConnell down there in his state, there the Russians bought
investing.
the aluminum factory there.
Sure, and, just to help them politically.
They brag about that they have that they passed right to work laws. So all the drug addicted and unemployed workers will work in their aluminum factory that's run by the Russians.
The right to work is a misnomer. It's the right to mooch and not pay your fair share, and the right for employers to destroy unions. So it's a phony name. But so you have some real bad big money interests, and they own the GOP lock, stock, and barrel. And in the Democratic Party, and by the way, I'm a working families Democrat, I think I mentioned that already, you have a mixed bag. And so you have Michael Bloomberg, who is not nearly as bad as any of the Republicans, and if he's the nominee, I'll support him, but he's obviously using a lot of his money to buy political influence. And then you have candidates such as Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who are funding their campaigns with small donations, and so am I, by the way. And can I mention my website here?
Sure,
joeseeman.com, JOESEEMAN.com, and whoever's watching this.
I offered both candidates to come on and have a discussion, not a debate. I don't believe in debates because that gets you nowhere. That's just mudslinging.
And if I can just mention my opponent, the incumbent, I have publicly, and I will get it and say right now, I've offered her to come have a dialogue, not debate, a dialogue with me, with the voters, anytime, any place. So I'll be organizing public forums on issues such as healthcare, issues such as fair taxation, issues such as the environment and climate action and green jobs. I'll be organizing, my campaign will be organizing public forums, and we'll invite the incumbent to every single one. So I think if you're running for public office, you want to represent the people, you've got to be out there with them.
I'm going to ask him to
keep
go back
going.
to policy, but before I do that, I'm going to plug some of my
go do your
podcasts
thing.
Here. One of the things that we have here that you did mention, the oligarch and stuff, point of information, Russians do not want chaos. The New York Times is wrong about that, and every politician who says so is wrong about that. They want control. They are doing now in America what in the last quarter of the 18th century, 1790s, they did in Poland. Exactly the same thing, the same way, for the same reasons.
Sure.
All right?
Sure.
They dismantled the Greater Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and the country disappeared for 123 years. All right? And that was a movement towards control.
Right.
The deterioration since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it only collapsed because oil prices went down, has thrown the state of Russia into a revanchist sort of stuff. They have a modern day capitalist based feudalism, and they're reconstructing not the old Soviet Union, trying to reconstruct the old Soviet Empire.
Right. But let's remember that the people, Putin, and his oligarchs are the old Communist Party people. Putin was a KGB spy chief, and so you have the same people who we were warned for decades. Why the Russians are dictatorship? They're not for democracy. There's no human rights. It's true. Political opponents are jailed and killed. Journalists jailed and killed. Well, that's still happening in Russia. Now they don't call themselves communists, but the same people who are the worst of what was called communism, the very worst of communism, are now partners with the GOP in America. So it's crazy. And talking
exactly what happened
and you were
in
talking
Europe.
about control or chaos. And for those of you who watch the TV show Get Smart, you can figure out what that's all about. I won't take off my shoe and start talking into it. So you're right. They want control. They want power. And perhaps chaos is a means. So certainly they want chaos within the Democratic Party. They want dissension. They want infighting.
That's part of the physics of the thing. They
Right.
really don't care.
Right. They care about money and power.
They want control. Yeah.
And
you can control by the debate. I don't know what problem people have a problem with the debate and people yelling at each other. It's called democracy. It's the old saying, I don't belong to an organized political party. I'm a Democrat.
there you go.
Right?
There you go.
That's I think that's the way democracy. I think democracy should be so noisy and so active that the only way you can take a vote is to ask one side to move on over to that side of the room and the other to move over to that. Which brings up something I'd like to ask you about.
Yes.
Being a computer guy,
Okay.
right?
Retired computer guy. I was a software developer, and I don't do that anymore. Thank God, Goddess, and whomever, whatever you want to thank for that.
Yeah, you have a little thing here about the donations. You say something here. Maybe you can explain
Go
this.
right ahead. Yes.
Seeman believes the state system of public campaign financing needs to go further. Now people who donate $250 or less would have their donations matched 6-1 for statewide office candidates. I'm going to ask you to explain that. But along with that, I was thinking this. Why not... It seems to me the technology there exists for the following. Why not a referendum for how much each candidate gets using an app? Why can't the people participate in government by, say, every Friday or every other Friday, a list of referendum issues that have been debated or argued in the government put out for people to vote on?
So
not just a poll, but something a
I
little bit
understand
stronger
what
than
you're
that.
talking about. So I'm all for participatory government, for democracy, for people getting involved.
And can't technology let us do that? I
Technology
mean, this podcast
could certainly assist in that. I think there are a lot of steps that we need to get to. So you're talking about some things such as having referendum, and there are lots of, there's actually
and recall.
And recall. Okay, so there's states that have that. The issue, of course, with having referendum, and we've seen in California how it's worked and not always worked that well, is that unfortunately the same big money dominates their referendum votes. So the underlying problem, and the first problem we've got to take, the first thing we've got to do is take on the problem of money dominating our political system. There's a political system. There's a lot.
So maybe
there's
you
many
could
other.
explain this thing
So
then.
there's many other reforms we can do. Also, make it easier for people to vote. We can register. Hopefully, we're hoping that this year's legislature will pass automatic voter registration. My opponent, by the way, is not for any of these reforms. And nor is the entire
let's
GOP.
get into policy, yeah.
So there's a lot of reforms. My opponent and the GOP is against all political reform, and so with campaign finance reform, we can do a lot of things to make we can do early voting, make voting easier. And in Oregon, they have mail-in voting, and that's works very well for them. So there are many things that we can do. I think that as far as having referendum, that's something down the line. But I like that. And there's a concept called participatory budgeting. And it's very simple. It's simply that the average people should participate in forums where we discuss the budget. Let's have charts. Sorry, we don't have visuals. Charts. How much money is going to this? How much money is going to that? And let's look at it and have average people give input. Now, right now, the budget process in Albany doesn't have that much input from average people. We're trying.
How would you see the physical operation of people participating more in government? You know, in Massachusetts, they have like this town hall, which is more than just getting together.
Town halls are essential. And I want you to know that I plan to do town hall type forums, town halls during my campaign before I'm elected. I pledge after elected to do regular, ongoing town halls. And when I say town halls, I mean things that are open to the public. Whatever party you are, whatever you believe in, you have an equal right to participate. Things that are moderated, forums, town halls, where the public is told about it well in advance. And we know that some politicians have phony town halls where they give you a day in advance notice and they let their own partisan buddies, their own political party allies know about well in advance, and they have somebody calling a few questions. You get a minute to ask your question. You get a baloney answer. You can't engage in that type of dialogue back and forth. So I want to have real town halls. And I'll mention that my opponent, the incumbent, you know that I haven't missed not a single town hall of hers since she's been elected. And do you know why?
Tell me.
Because she hasn't had a stinking town hall, not one. So,
question.
So what you have is a political establishment. This Saratoga County GOP is a machine, political machine. They think that their people own the government, and they think that their candidates don't have to have town halls. I want just about the opposite. So that's one of the many ways we can get people involved in government. And there's a lot. We can make it easier for people to vote. Our voter rate of voting is awful. There are many other countries where people vote much more. So we've done some things. We've created just last year. We created early voting. So if you're busy on the one day, November 3rd, you can't make it there, you can vote a week beforehand. You can find a time to vote. There are many reforms we can do, make it easier for people to get involved, and when you make it easier for people to have a voice, to be part of it, you make sure that the super rich don't control everything, and that's the basis for all the reforms we need.
Would the issue of, which is very popular now, talking about, or mistalking about, is the Medicaid for all. Is that relevant to?
Sure. Sure. So for New York, there's a lot of relevance. There's a bill that was been introduced called the New York Health Act, and I can talk a little bit about that, and I support that, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so I want to give you the principles that I think need to guide us on our healthcare policies. So first principle is everybody in, nobody out. Everybody in. Everybody. If you're sick, you can go to see a doctor, whether you've got the money or not. If you have an opioid addiction, you can get into a treatment program instead of waiting a month or two if you don't have the money. If you've got to choose between your medication or your rent, that's some of the obscene costs people paying for their medicines. So we want to make sure that people can get their medicines. So the number one principle of healthcare is that everybody is in, everybody is covered, everybody gets health care. There's nobody in New York who should die from lack of health care. And yes, people have died because they didn't get the care they need.
What can the assembly do
Sure.
What can be done in the assembly?
So we want to give people health care. We also want to save people money. And we want to stop paying welfare, corporate welfare, to insurance companies. And I'll explain to you how the New York Health Act does that. So it creates, instead of corporate, private health insurance, it creates public health protection. So insurance companies, let me try and explain why they exist. Now, if God forbid you have a terrible thing and you've got to go into the hospital and you need a procedure that will cost $80,000, you don't have the money in your pocket, do you?
No.
Okay, me neither. Maybe some people do, but most of us don't. And the reason we have insurance
I've
companies...
had that experience
Sure, the
with
reason...
my daughter.
Yes, many of us have had that. And the reason that insurance companies exist is not because they're giving us anything. So the amount of money we pay from our premiums, or the amount the employers pay, the amount the government kicks in for many people's insurance, the total amount of money that's going into the insurance company is more than the amount they spend paying for our health care, and because they have corporate profits and insane multi-million-dollar CEO salaries, and there's a lot of money they're making. So we don't have insurance companies because they're doing something for us. We have insurance companies simply because they're a deep pocket. In the case of a big expense, they can cover it because they've got lots of people and they'll make money in the long run. Well, guess who else has got a deep pocket? You and me and all of us collectively as the state of New York, the people of the state of New York, we can do anything that an insurance company can. We have just as much money as any insurance company, and so there's no reason to pay insurance companies, especially, let's talk about public employees, and I'm a retired public employee, and you've been there. So our state employees, our town employees, our village, our county, even our school district employees, our taxes are paying for their health insurance. The health insurance costs have been going way up. They're astronomical, and the money is going into the pockets of insurance company, and then they're sending back a little bit, and there's absolutely no reason. So we can save the costs. Now, let's think about it. In a place like Canada, their per capita costs are close to half of what we are on healthcare. They're dramatically lower. We can save a lot of money, and there's a committee. One of the groups that I'm involved in, Saratoga Progressive Actions, an indivisible affiliated group that I've been involved in as an activist, has a Saratoga Healthcare Committee that's done a lot of the research, and they've shown how much money each school district, each town government, each county government, and the state government can save by getting rid of the completely unnecessary insurance companies. And so with the New York Health Act, which does that, 98% of New Yorkers are going to save money. And I'm talking about your taxes, your insurance premiums, your co-pays, your out-of-pockets. You look at the whole picture, we can give everyone health care. No one's going to die. No one's going to suffer because they don't have the health care they need. We can save money for most of us, and we can cut our school taxes, cut our property taxes. We can make this much more efficient. You know, I'm for the New York Health Act, but I'm also open to anybody else's ideas. So my campaign is going to be about, here are some of the ideas that I support, but as I mentioned before, town halls, speaking to people. I'm knocking on doors today, talking to voters, and I've been doing that for a while. I'll be talking to voters directly at forums, in person, and hear what they have to say. So let me give you an example of a medical professional. In my old age, I do go to see medical professionals occasionally, and I won't mention this one by name, just not to embarrass them. But a medical professional who I've seen who has a small practice. I think there are 2 or 3 practitioners in the office. They've got 4 people doing administrative work, paperwork, and the research has shown that we have 4 times as much paperwork dealing with the insurance companies. If we went with the New York Health Act, that same office could have 1 person doing the paperwork, and what the practitioner told me is he'd rather hire 3 people to actually cure the sick, actually provide treatment. So instead of paying for that, for the administrative, you can have more health care for people for the same amount of money, that we're already spending. But this practitioner, he had an idea that he told me about. He said, can we do something to give incentives for practitioners to offer lower costs? So he said there's a particular thing that he does, and everybody gets paid $150 for that procedure. Now, he's saying that he thinks he may be able to provide it for $100 or $125, and maybe we should create some kind of incentive, and that's something that's not in the New York Health Act. So while I support the New York Health Act, I think that I'm open to good ideas, and by the person who gave me that protection is not a Democrat. So I'm open to ideas from Democrats, Republicans, Independents, anybody. I mentioned Working Families Party people too, because I like them a lot. But these are some of the principles that we want to go with. The New York Health Act is a great way to get there. If there are any changes that we need to do, if there's anybody got any issues to it, I'm willing to hear it. And I'm also for the good not being the enemy, the perfect not being the enemy of the good. So if we can't get every single New Yorker insured, which I wish we could, and if we can't save all that money, if we can get somewhere there, I'm for that. As we know, back 10 years ago, the Affordable Care Act is going to turn 10 years old in a couple of weeks, by the way. So back then, many of us were calling for universal health care for everybody. There were people like
free health care.
Right. We pay for it, but we'd paying a lot less. For free, pay for it through our taxes and pay a lot less.
It can, should, and is, and originally was intended to be free. It was part of the Economic Security Act, which later became the Social Security Act,
right,
and was taken out. And
that's
the
right.
whole idea was that another misnomer.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Ladies and gentlemen, Social Security is not a safety net. It was never intended to be a safety net. Read the legislation. Read the law. It was supposed to be that income which provides a comfortable life.
Yes. And we can do more on Social Security, but just moving back to the idea about the Affordable Care Act, and that's a federal issue, and I know I'm running for New York State Assembly, but you had something in the past that
gets
gave
implemented on the local level.
Exactly. And one of the things that we took tens of millions of Americans and gave them health care. We've saved thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lives because we passed the Affordable Care Act. I was one of the people fighting for it, and we were trying to fight to also have a public option, which is now what some candidates are talking about. Some people are talking about complete public health protection, or some people are talking about a public option. But I was for that, even though it wasn't perfect. So what I'm going to fight for in the New York State legislature is to try and get something like the New York Health Act, which will insure everybody, which will save money for 98% of New Yorkers. And if we can get somewhere halfway there, I'll be for that. And so it doesn't have to be perfection. We'll try for that. But I'm also for moderate reforms, and whether we can have great changes or small changes, I'll be fighting for all that.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you a question that I'm pretty sure you don't know the answer to, or anyone else.
Okay.
All right?
Okay.
It's a issue that concerns every single retiree and every single state employee who has a retirement, a pension upcoming. And I want to see how you're going to handle it when someone brings to you a problem you don't know.
Okay, I'm listening.
Okay? Right now, and for decades, the retirement system has required couples, married and unmarried, who have worked for the state or who have pensions from some state agency or from some state that isn't even New York State. All right. What has happened is when they have been misinformed that that the pension, the options other than the single life option, is a kind of insurance, and it isn't. All right, it's a pension. It's not an insurance. What they have done, and I've done a survey to ask and find out from people. You'll take a married couple that are retired, and I ask them what option do they have, and they'll say, well, we have option 2 or 3 or something like that.
Right.
I said, do both of you have it? And they'll say yes. Now, first of all, that's illegal. All right, not by them.
Okay, I didn't know that.
It's illegal for the government to allow it. But what that does is it means that for one provider death benefit,
Mm-hmm.
both people are paying,
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
which diminishes both of their retirement income. At the end of which, if one of them passes, they've paid in something they'll never get.
But doesn't their surviving spouse
And
get it? If they
That's the other problem. They wind up getting more than they had because they no longer have to pay the fee to cover the person that deceased.
okay
So they get their full, and they still get
from their deceased
from
partner.
deceased spouse. So they're making a profit by the death of their spouse. Now it becomes particularly egregious in the case of two divorced people because it's an inducement to knock the other person off.
So when you're divorced, you can't change the survivor thing. They
Right.
maintain. Okay, great.
Right.
I happen
And-
to
and
have
by
been
the
married
way-
for many decades, and I didn't know about that. All things you learn.
It's the whole economics of the physics of the economics of the money is
Sure.
hidden because it's never spent. So the problem is hidden. It's particularly egregious too if it's say someone that works for New York State and someone that works for California.
Okay.
You'll never see it. You'll
So-
never see the problem there. I asked for freedom of information. We just started 180 cases, of which about 84, something like that, were these sorts of things. And
Right.
that is a diminution of a. Now it is prohibited by the IRS. So the fact that it exists under this policy threatens our defined status. The defined status of our $200 billion fund, right? Also, it's cheating people out of their retirement. Now, there is a mechanism required. You go to the retirement application for, say, 1199, a union, or you go to any place else that's doing the job right, and the only one-page application is for someone who has never been married and for whom there is no one that can possibly make a claim on their retirement, all right? But everything else is like an 8-page thing because you need to get a sign-off from people who could make a claim to your retirement, right? Or they have to be accounted for. Or, as happens in court, and it can happen in court, it's set up in the court laws dealing with divorce, but it's also, everything I'm saying applies to married people too, is that you're supposed to work out an offset kind of a thing,
Okay.
all right, without getting into the details. The important thing is, and so the point is there's solutions and there's correct ways of doing
Sure.
it.
So
all
you
right?
want to give
It's
me my
just not being done.
So you want me to give my take on this? So you're right. This is not an issue that I'm familiar with, and I am familiar with a lot of the big issues that I couldn't pontificate, or not more than pontificate, but actually, hopefully, effect into legislation about taking action for climate change, but building green jobs that'll be the foundation of the economy of upstate New York. We talked about health care, about corruption, reform. So many issues I know all about. This ain't one of them. So here's how I'd respond. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I have the answers, but what one would do is take a logical approach. If you're in the assembly, you get somebody comes and tells you this is something we have to do. So you have staff who do research. You have committees. So perhaps there's a civil service committee under whose auspices this type of research should be done. You reach out to the staff on the committees and you connect with perhaps you as a constituent or some other constituent who brings that to my attention as an assembly member. and we do the research, and we figure out what the right solution is. And what I want to say is that I almost embarrassed that I have to even say it, but I want to legislate based on science. And people say, well, duh, of course. But you have a political party, the Republican Party, that denies the validity of science, of the scientific method itself. So on the issue of climate change, you have the impeached White House resident says that climate change is a hoax from China. Whereas we have the entire scientific community is in consensus that climate change is a very real thing. It's a very serious threat. It could threaten millions or perhaps billions of people's lives and is already causing great damage. We can see terrible fires in Australia and lots of other problems as a result. So getting back to simply science. So we do research, we do science, and that's how we approach every problem. So the issue you're talking about, I don't have the answer, but I want to have an answer based on science and
if someone comes
research.
To you with a problem,
yes,
they can, from this interview, they can feel reasonably assured that they're going to get listened to and they're going to get some direction on how this problem may be addressed.
And, okay, also from a lens of what's fair and what's just. So if you're describing a problem where it's not fair, where this couple are paying too much in effect, if they're, and it's not a fair thing, that's the underlying principle. So there are politicians, my opponent, I'm afraid, is among them, whose principle they operate in is how does this benefit the people who fund them? How does it benefit Wall Street? How does it benefit oil companies? How does it benefit insurance companies? And you can see by their policies, that's obviously the principle. Does it, they
Very
think
good.
they work
Thank you.
for the very rich, and that's the principle that I'm going to approach every single issue. How does it affect what's fair, what's right, what benefits the most of us, not just the very few? So that's how I'm going to approach this. And the other thing I just want to mention, I'm running as a working families Democrat, and to caucus with a Democratic majority, I'll be in a position, unlike my opponent, I'll be in a position to get legislation introduced and passed. I'll be working with the majority. My opponent, the incumbent, has never gotten any significant piece of legislation at all passed. She has essentially no say. So I will be a voice for the average people. I'll have town halls we talked about, hear the voice of people, and affect what they want.
Okay. Any last words?
Go to my website, joeseeman.com. Let's keep in touch. If you live in the capital region, in the Saratoga, Schenectady counties, look me up. We need volunteers. We're not funded by corporate PACs, not by billionaires, and the only way we can win is by average people getting involved. Tell us what you want. Tell us what you want me to do in the New York State Assembly. Go to my website, joeseeman.com, and let's keep in touch.